I stand on many shoulders to be here today. I'm a product of Augusta University of Georgia Southern, and one of my Georgia Southern professors is here as a surprise treat. Several friends from Dalton College are here, where I taught for 5 years. And I'm also a product of the history department at Auburn University. And as Leslie said a moment ago, I'm teaching at College of Coastal Georgia, down at the bottom of the state. So a little bit about the book. This book, the inspiration came from Barbara Duncan. I don't know how many of you know Barbara, if anybody, but she was the education director at the Museum of the Cherokee Indians. She's now an adjunct instructor at University of North Carolina, Asheville. And when I asked Barbara several years ago what needed to be done, what story needed to be told with the Cherokee, she said the Dragging Canoe Rebellion. And so that's what this book initially started out with. And so when I started investigating the Dragging Canoe Rebellion, I realized the period from 1730 to 1790 made no sense to me. So I went to other people's books and I read their history of this period, and it still made no sense to me. So I started doing my own research, and this book is the end result of that research. The Dragging Canoe Rebellion of the 1770s, right in the middle of the American Revolution, was connected to the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1760 and 61. And then that made no sense until I went to the Friendship Treaty that the Cherokees signed with Britain all the way back to 1730. So that's the genesis of this story. And I know the organization is most interested in removal and what a story that is, start to finish. The only thing I tell you is, I think what I'm about to speak to you about is what set the Cherokees up as one of the tribes that Andrew Jackson wanted to go first. You know from your history he wanted a large southern Indian tribe to be the first to be a part of his removal program, and he had in mind the Cherokees. And I think the events that happened between 1730 and 1790 are what set all that in motion. So this is the original, a little bit about how the book went wrong in various places. This was the original cover. That was a piece of artwork that I chose from a Chattanooga artist, Marty Martin, who graciously agreed for this to be the cover. And about 3 days before it went to press, the publisher notified me this artwork was not good enough. Not in terms of quality, but the print we had of it was not good enough to reproduce to the cover. So this was the cover for about 2 weeks. On Walmart, it still is the cover. You can try to buy the book on Walmart.com. And at this point, when they said this is the cover you're stuck with, I walked away from the project completely. And so it's when they came back to me 2 weeks later that we collaborated and went back to that cover, which was a piece of artwork that we already had permission to use. And even though it was second choice, I think it turned out pretty well. I'm very happy with that part of it. So one thing you should know about big gun historians, these would be the professional historians who work at the Research One universities. They do work to prevent scholars like me from publishing. I know that sounds like sour grapes, but they want themselves to be the only ones to publish. And in particular, I had some run-ins with one who's at the University of Georgia, one who's recently retired from Auburn University, and one recently retired from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So they do work in their own ways to try to stop people from publishing if they're from the smaller schools. And that's where I've always worked. So one of the things I tried to look at was what destabilized Cherokee society between 1730 and 1790. And here's what I came up with that's covered in the book. The fur traders who lived among them, like Eleazar Wiggin, Cherokees referred to him as Old Rabbit. In their own way, they destabilized Cherokee society because when they married Indian women, they insisted that those children have last name identity instead of clan identity. And I know that you all know that among the Cherokee, family identity comes through your mother's line, through your clan. Epidemic disease, the period I covered, the Cherokees were hit by smallpox. And their medical people, their shamans had no treatments available. And they really thoroughly destabilized Cherokee culture. In especially contact with the colonies of Virginia and South Carolina, particularly the government of Charleston, South Carolina, destabilized the Cherokees. Both governors, William Henry Littleton and William Bull, So, the story starts out with 7 Cherokees representing the clans being tapped to go to London to formalize a peace treaty of alliance with the British government, and this happened in 1730. And the politician, the diplomat that I researched so much is Attakullakulla, and he's the shortest of the diplomats here on this side. That actually works, wow. So the Articles of Friendship from 1730, 7 Cherokees board the HMS Fox for a trip to Britain. And this trip made those 7 superstars. They were superstars in Indian culture because they actually got to see where the British were. They actually got to see their home culture, the capital city. Now, as you can imagine, their translator who went with them was Eliza Wiggin, Old Rabbit, and the people in charge of the trip tried to find the most economical way for the Cherokees to be housed. And so the cheapest thing was a basement apartment in an undertaker's home. I do not think that if they knew exactly where they were staying, they would have been so thrilled to be there. But be that as it may. They signed a friendship treaty called the Articles of Friendship. And the treaty describes a link of friendship extending from the breast of King George II directly to the Cherokee people. And the Cherokees were happy with this. They understood from the start it required them to fight for the British on command. And they knew this, and they accepted this. What they did not quite understand was the treaty also gave Britain dominion over all Cherokee lands here. So when they questioned their translator about their passage, he told them it was figurative, not literal. Well, to the British, it is literal. They are now becoming subject people under the British government. The South Carolina Governor Robert Johnson witnessed them signing the document and told them it was in their best interest, and so the chiefs decided to sign it. And they understood it to mean that the land ownership was figurative. By the 1750s, the Cherokees, now comfortable with their new allies who were providing them trade goods through traders, began to lobby their ally for some forts in the backcountry. I know it's strange to think the Cherokees would want military presence among them, but they took the forts like Fort Prince George here. They took it as a sign of British affection for them. They took it as a sign of respect. And they wanted the forts as a place where they could go to trade and go for protection if they needed it from their enemies. They just assumed the British would protect them. So Fort Prince George is near the modern South Carolina town of Pickens, South Carolina. The site is under Lake Jocassee now. And the leaders who helped negotiate this, and these are the men I spent my time on with this Punashote, Ostayanko, Oconostota, and then the guy I researched the most, Attakullakulla, whom the English are going to call a little carpenter. Well, he's short. We say that. His Cherokee name means, and I should have greeted you in Cherokee, Oshio, and ski for the opportunity to be with you today. So my guy Attakullakulla is going to spend the 1760s doing 2 things, one of which is going to try to leverage himself as to be the preeminent chief in relationship with the British. And to do that, he's going to have to replace an older voice called Punashote. And so there are politics involved in this. The Fort Prince George went through without much hassle. And then in the 1750s, the British government wanted the Cherokees to fight for them in the French and Indian War. And a lot of that fighting took place up in western Pennsylvania at Fort Duquesne. I know that you know the Cherokees' real name is Aniunwia, the principal people. And so when the British came to them and said, come fight for us in this war with the treaty, the Cherokees used a little bit of economic leverage and said, we will if you build a second fort. We want a second fort in the Overhills country. So this is a case of them showing a little bit of agency. They are requesting the ally do something back for them. Now, the request to fight is not unusual. As I said, they expected it. They met the request. But they want this fort in exchange for it. If any of you have not had the chance to visit the reconstructed Fort Loudon near Van Nord, Tennessee, please put that on your bucket list. It's a nice site, and if you go on Reenactors Day, you'll get to see not only people doing a very good job of reenacting, but it's always fun to watch people with a Southern accent pull off a British accent, as they try to do. The Cherokees, once the British government agreed to build the second fort near the Overhills towns, then the Cherokees began to commit to full participation in the war. They'll eventually send about 800 troops into the battlefield. George Washington thought they were absolutely essential to help win the war. He lobbied for them in every case. I guess he used the old adage of the only way to deal with French Indians is to employ other Indians. And so he was very committed to their participation in the war. This is Attakulla, the preeminent diplomat that I worked on. And he actually is one of the Cherokees who goes to the northern battlefield to fight. Now, one of the things that historian Paul Kelton has pointed out is not only did the Cherokees help fight around Fort Duquesne, this fort in the western corner of Pennsylvania, they actually talked to France's Indian allies, and they convinced those Indians to drop out of the war. And if you know French and Indian War, you know that the French armies, half of them were made up of these Indian allies, like Shawnees, Delawares, and Mingos. When the Cherokees lobbied them, and they eventually drop out these other Indians, well, that cripples France's war effort, and it has to, they begin losing the battles they were once winning. So, to sort of look at the chiefs that make up what I call the triumvirate of Cherokee voices in this period, Ostenaco, also known as Judd's friend, was an independent chief. He wanted to navigate and stay clear of both British and French influence. Oconostota was a war chief, also known as Great Warrior, and whenever there was trouble with the British, he always gravitated toward the French. He always went to the French and sought their influence and explanation about problems going on. So ultimately, some 800 Cherokees journey to Fort Duquesne and do battle. And so they've been asked by their British ally to come up and fight, and the British cannot supply them. One of the disasters was a wagon load of supplies for the Cherokees being destroyed as it was crossing a river. So that was one set of supplies lost. And then the other people involved, General John Forbes, was supposed to keep them supplied, and so was Robert Dinwiddie, the governor of Virginia. General Forbes could not supply them, neither could Dinwiddie, and so the Cherokees spent their downtime from the war going to British camps begging for food. So that is what you have your allies doing in their downtime from the war. So to the Cherokees, this means the allies suddenly, for some reason they don't understand, doesn't value them very much. They're not being supplied either with food or guns. And what they hoped was to finish the war and go home by November so they could be in time for hunting season. Now, Forbes, in all of Forbes' letters, he ends each letter asking whoever he is writing for to please send him prunes and dates and raisins. He has a really bad constipation problem. I guess it's all that time in the saddle. Now, when he met with Attakulla, he said that he found this Cherokee leader who was requesting food and supplies from the troops to be nothing more than a consummate dog out for all he could get. So this is a preeminent Cherokee diplomat, and this is what a British officer says about him. Again, the Cherokees pick up the tone of this. Cherokee history to me makes no sense unless you apply a concept called diakta, which is balance. It applies to all things. There must be enough men to balance women. There must be enough children to balance elderly. The world makes no sense unless there is balance. And so when their allies couldn't supply them, that was imbalance. And so the Cherokees decided to correct the balance and get the food and supplies they were entitled to. And the way they chose it was not the best way. On their way home from the battlefield to Cherokee country, they looted settlers' homes, stealing food, and in particular, 60 horses. This happened in Halifax and Bedford counties of Virginia. And I have a working theory that they had a large Scots-Irish population, because usually if there's trouble between the Cherokees and settlers, it's Scots-Irish. I cannot prove this at this time, but that's my theory. So the settlers go after the Cherokees to get the stolen supplies back, and they kill some of them. At the same time, other Cherokees staying in the war had been concluding meetings with the French allies, the Shawnees, Delawares, and Mingos, and they got them to drop out of the war. And the Brits signed a treaty with these other Indians, the Treaty of Easton. And this not only drops these tribes out of the war, it promised all of the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi to Indians after the war. So imagine how the settlers are going to feel after a war called French and Indian War, to learn all this rich farmland west of the Appalachians is going to be reserved to Indians, because partly of what the Cherokees had done. When Cherokees in the battlefield learned that Cherokees returning home have been attacked by settlers, this is what prompts the rest of the Cherokees to lead the battle. And you know, from the British point of view, it will mean they did not fulfill their war obligations. They quit, they were cheated, they left. So Virginia settlers killed 24 Cherokees on their way home. So remember D'Octa, that's balance. Things are out of balance now. And so the Cherokees sent, eventually they will send warriors into the back countries of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina to kill in revenge, in the law of blood, for these Cherokees who were killed, killing 19 in the Yadkin and Catawba River valleys alone. Immediately, Attakulla went into diplomacy mode and tried to meet with the governors of Virginia and South Carolina to smooth this over. He also went back to the general who called him a consummate dog to try to make the peace and mediate this conflict. And he does this for the Cherokees all throughout the 50s and 60s. South Carolina Governor William Henry Littleton, interestingly, he and the Virginia governor contacted the Cherokee leaders to apologize for the murders of Cherokees coming home from the battlefield. So the governors took a different take on this at first. Littleton promised to send presents to the families of slain Cherokees along with his apologies. But he ultimately, because Cherokees keep killing settlers in the backcountry, he cuts off trade with the Cherokees. And then, and it's one of the reasons I call him the architect of everything that went wrong, he decided that 24 Cherokees would have to be turned over to South Carolina government, and they would be put to death for the murders of all the settlers in the backcountry. This was going to correct the imbalance. Now, he took this to his council in Charleston, and the council was so split on the plan of holding Cherokees hostage to wait for the murderers to surrender themselves. The council was split 4-4, and Littleton cast the tie-breaking vote to make sure his plan passed of taking Cherokee diplomats. Now, the way the Cherokees walk into this is they were sending 55 delegates down to Charlestown to negotiate this situation, the deaths of the settlers. They wanted to make peace. They wanted to restore the good relationship. So these 55 delegates walk right into basically being taken prisoner. And they are peace delegates. So Charleston Harbor. One of the ways the Cherokees knew that things were bad is Governor Littleton would not listen to any of their talks. And they were there to smooth over things, to restore the peace. He would not take talks from any of them. Said they did not represent their people. He tells them that he plans to take them back to Fort Prince George, again, up near Pickens, South Carolina. And he is going to take the entire delegation, including the war chief, Oconostota. Attakulla was able to actually get the release of the war chief, and part of the reason is the two families are intermarried. Attakulla is married to one of of Conestoga's daughters. And so, in partial compliance of what the governor is now demanding, the Cherokees do turn over 2 of the men who murdered settlers in the backcountry. Well, that leaves 22 others. And the governor is insisting that either the original murderers be brought in or acceptable substitutes. And he bragged to his council that either the Cherokees could put them to death or he would put them to death in a manner of his own choosing. And he was kind of glib about it. He seemed pleased with himself. So the delegates arrived back to Fort Prince George, and it is now under the command of Captain Richard Coitmore, and his personal assistant is Ensign Bell. I thought you might be interested to know how these 2 men celebrated their new posting to Fort Prince George. They got drunk. They went out into the nearby Cherokee town of Kiowee, and they molested Cherokee women in more than one home. And molest is a nice word for what I'm saying they did. They went into the homes of women whose men were away and did this. And finally, they went into the homes of men who were fighting for them at Fort Duquesne in the backcountry. So they are going to the homes of Cherokee soldiers doing this. They did this not once, but twice. And as more and more scholarship shows now, if there's going to be problems with our southeastern Indians, it usually means that somebody has done something to their women. Either mistreated them, abused them, raped them. So, about the time that these delegates are brought up and held in Fort Prince George, troops returning from the battlefield, both British and Cherokees, have come back into the region. Many of them have been infected with smallpox. And so this will be the second great epidemic that goes through the Cherokees. And it will begin to kill soldiers and hostages alike. And it starts to kill Cherokees who are being held hostage in the fort. And so this really starts a panic among the Cherokees, that not only are there people being held, they're being killed by this illness. And Attakullakulla begins to offer some compromises. I'm very struck at what a skilled diplomat he was. He absolutely refused to turn over 22 Cherokees, but told the British, I will go out and get 22 French scouts for you. The French are your enemy, we will bring you their scouts. These will be substitutes. How about that offer? And Coitmore, the fort commander, said no. Captain John Stewart was in the British fort in the Overhills country. He was a Scot. He was well connected to the family of Attakullakulla, who eventually adopted him into Attakullakulla's wolf clan. And Stewart had an ongoing relationship with mixed-blood Cherokee woman Susanna Emery while he was posted to Fort Loudon. This would have put him near the Cherokee town of Chota. Now, mind you, Stewart had a legal wife back in Charleston, and so many of these backcountry men do have legal wives, but they almost always have relationships with Cherokee women if they're posted in the backcountry. Same is true of the fur traders. All had Indian wives. Attakullakulla went to Captain Stewart and asked him for help in this matter, and Stewart said, I can't, my hands are tied. And Stewart wrote Governor Littleton after his talk with Attakullakulla and said, Attakullakulla will give in to what you want. He will put up a show of resistance for his people. It will be all theater, it will be all drama, but then he will fall in line and surrender the 22 men. Actually, that is not the way it's going to work out. Attakullakulla and Conestoga met with Paul Demir, the commander of Fort Loudon. He also refused to intervene with this surrender treaty demand. And none of the leaders, each of these men represent leaders from different towns. None of them want to turn over their Cherokee men to be killed for what has happened in the backcountry. One of my favorite references to this, when Attakullakulla was asked to turn over men, he said, when I look among the Cherokee men, I do not see those boys who made rash, unwise decisions in the backcountry and killed the settlers. I see grown men who are regretful and remorseful for their actions. That was his way of saying, the people who did it are still here, but I'm not going to turn them over. They did things as boys that they regret as men, and I'm just not going to turn them over. Both Oconostota and Atakula tried to get the commanders of the two forts, Prince George and Fort Loudon, to intervene in some way, and they kept trying. The last time they tried was February 14, 1760. Now, of the 22 who Cherokees captured in the fort, there were only 14 still alive. Some have died from smallpox by now, and it is killing the British troops too. So that last attempt was literally the last attempt. On 16 February, 2 Cherokee women came to Fort Prince George, and they requested that Captain Quickmore come out and speak with them. That Oconostota wanted to talk to him about an upcoming trip to Charlestown to talk to the governor. So Quickmore came out of the fort so did Ensign Bell, ironically. And the British leader and the Cherokee leader talked to each other back and forth across the Kiowa River. When Oconostota found that Quickmore was not going to change his position, not going to give up the hostages, he took out a saddle and swung it over his head 3 times. And at that point, Cherokees hidden in the brush opened fire on all the officers who had come out of the fort to talk, to parley. They hit both Quickmore and Bell. Quickmore's wound is going to wind up being fatal. Remember, these are the 2 men who have molested Cherokee women. I don't think this is coincidental. This is restoring the balance. The attack shocks the men in the fort. They pull Quickmore and Bell inside. Ensign Mill was the next ranking officer. He was also a medical doctor. He said that the rest of the troops in Fort Prince George wanted to kill all the remaining 14 hostages, but he stopped them. He said the only thing that would satisfy them was if they were allowed to put the Cherokees in leg irons, to put them in restraints. And so he did allow the troops to go in and put in the restraints. The Cherokees inside the fort fought back, and at that point, the Cherokees, the soldiers killed them all, killed all 14 remaining. So this is the Fort Prince George massacre. The Cherokees in the Overhills immediately in response laid siege to Fort Loudon. That was the most distant fort, letting nothing in or out, and this siege will last for the next 6 months. They are literally going to starve it into submission. Meanwhile, Governor Littleton has requested British military aid, British regulars. And so Colonel Archibald Montgomery's troops arrived in Cherokee country in June 1760. And all the British military had the opinion that you cannot reason with the Cherokees. The only thing they understand is brute force, absolute violence, literally shove their face into the dirt and grind it into the dirt. And what's particularly, I think, enlightening about this is the exact same attitude the American military will adopt from the British. This is the only thing the Cherokees understand, is brute, crude violence. So ironically, with everything that had happened, the Cherokees decided that the balance between their people and Britain was satisfied. These troops arrived in Charlestown in April. They will not make it to Cherokee country until June. The Cherokees have put in spring crops. They are back into full peace mode, except for the hostage situation at Fort Loudon. So they are a bit shocked when British troops come into their country and start devastating the lower towns down where Kiowa is. And you might know one of these lower towns if you've ever been through Dillard, Georgia. Estato is where Dillard is now. So we talk about, in these narratives, we expect the Indians to provide the brutality, right? Well, when the British troops came into these towns, they found some Cherokees too sick to fight. And so they burned them alive in their cabins. That was their way of both doing containment of disease and providing the brute violence that was necessary to make the Cherokees more malleable. Montgomery's troops burned 200 cabins to ashes, killed 60 to 80 men, women, and children, took 40 prisoners, and he especially made sure that they destroyed whatever food was there, so they want starvation to come after this devastation. So here's some of the towns in the little red triangles. And that's a mess to look at, I know. Montgomery's troops reached the middle towns by late June. So if you've ever been to Franklin, North Carolina, that was Niquosi. That was a major town. It's a middle town. Montgomery's troops reached the middle towns by late June 1760, and Oconostota, that war chief, leads Cherokee troops to fight. The first battle was at Ochoe, just south of modern Franklin, at a place called Crow's Pass. Now, the Cherokees fought back with sort of a life or death effort here. Montgomery sustained 100 dead or wounded, found Ochoe completely deserted, decided at that point, since they had taken such a walloping from the Cherokees, not to pursue them deeper into the mountains. He decided he had punished them enough, but of course he's going to burn every town in his path. So he will return with his troops to Fort Prince George. He had destroyed the lower towns, and ironically, Oconostota's prestige is going to really grow because he fought the great British general, and Montgomery's prestige is going to grow because he fought the Cherokees and gave them a pounding. So the troops at Fort Loudon, if you ever visit Fort Loudon, I always get a sense that if you were a British regular, this must have been the hind end of nowhere to you. It's an isolated place. It's beautiful country. Of course, Tellico Lake was not there in those days because Tellico Dam was not there. But very isolated place if you're a British soldier. And imagine being cut off by the Cherokees in this hind end of nowhere place. And the siege lasted 6 months. Some of the Cherokee women who had relations with the soldiers there brought them food. And you can sort of question loyalties here. But these relationships are very real, and they affect what happens both to the Brits and the Cherokees. Captain Paul Demir was commander here, and he decided in August to hold a council of officers to decide whether to surrender Loudon or not, and the vote was yes. The Cherokees granted them safe passage for a trip. All the soldiers were going to be eligible to go back down to Fort Prince George in safety. They were going to march out with safe passage. They could carry whatever small arms and luggage they could carry, but the bulk of the fort's weapons, 12 cannons, 1,000 pounds of ammo, small arms, all that was to be left behind for the Cherokees. And Captain Demir signed this surrender with Oconostota on August 7th, 1760. It was the first time a British garrison had ever surrendered to indigenous people anywhere. The Cherokees go in the record books for that. First time the Brits ever surrendered. When the commander of British forces in North America read this report on the surrender of Fort Loudon, he didn't believe it. He thought it was a lie. He thought someone was pulling his leg because, of course, no Brits would surrender to indigenous people, but they did. And General Jeffrey Amherst is the person who did not believe that a British garrison had ever surrendered. So when the Brits evacuate and the Cherokees take possession of the fort, they discover that the troops have either spiked the weapons, they've rendered them unusable, like cannons, or they have thrown the small sidearms and the ammo in the river. So from the British point of view, I totally understand securing weapons to the enemy, but the surrender treaty did say the weapons were theirs. So Paul Demir and his troops are marching back south to the fort. They get about a day's journey from the fort they've abandoned, and the Cherokees catch up to them. They attack them and killed 29 of them, and this becomes the Fort Loudon Massacre. And they say the worst for Captain Paul Demir, and I think Ken Smith, the artist here, has done a good job in portraying this. They scalped Demir. So this is brutality from the other side. We've talked about British brutality. They scalped Demir and made him dance for them. One by one, they cut off arms and legs so that only the torso is left. The final indignity was when they picked up dirt from the ground and stuffed it into his mouth, saying, here's all the land you will ever want. Here's all of our land you will ever want. So, brutality, no way to get around that. Well, to the to the Cherokees, now the matter was concluded, but of course, you know the British are not going to let this go unpunished. Amherst orders a second expedition to come back into Cherokee country, 2,000 men this time, and in his words, this will wipe out the disgrace the Indians had inflicted upon His Majesty's arms. Grant's troops come back into the Middle Towns in early June 1760. Just a second. Check something. This would be 1761. I've got a mistake with my image there. They come back to the Middle Towns. This time, a Cherokee leader named Saraway led Cherokees at Ochoe again. The Cherokees gave full combat until they ran out of ammunition and then ran from the field of battle. Grant's troops torched every town they found, especially again destroying all food supplies. Over the next 2 weeks, Grant attacked and burned 15 little towns, including, ironically, one named Burning Town, which, after his visit, literally was. Again, they burned people who were sick with smallpox in their cabins. And they even killed one man who had fought for them at Fort Duquesne, a Cherokee man who fought for them there. Like his predecessor, Montgomery, Grant called off the attack after he felt like he had done enough damage and returned to Fort Prince George in July of 1761. 1761, the Cherokee chiefs signed a surrender treaty with Colonel James Grant at Fort Prince George. And Article 6 of the peace treaty named Attakullakulla as governor of the Cherokees, a position that had never existed before. So from the British point of view, this means they only want to speak with Attakullakulla. They do not want to speak with all these other chiefs, and the Cherokees have a tradition of all their chiefs participating. So this is so devastating. What it creates in the 1760s is Cherokee leaders like Attakullakulla who will do anything to avoid conflicts like this that were so devastating. And I hate to use the term appeasement, but they become appeasement chiefs. They will agree to any British demand, any colonial demand, just to avoid war as Montgomery and Grant had brought into their towns. British established the proclamation line of 1763, and that was actually a fulfillment of what the Brits had promised with the Treaty of Easton. They've actually gone on record as creating the first Indian reservation, a big one. There's always a Georgia history moment that's teachable somewhere, somehow. The idea of the proclamation line belongs to Georgia Royal Governor Henry Ellis. That was his idea. And for the British, this was going to be a temporary stopgap so they would quit having so many problems between Indians and colonials. What they are realizing is they can't handle all these conflicts. So some historians have said the British Empire, when it comes to Indian country, was a theoretical empire because they cannot control what's happening on the border of colonies. What I don't think we've really talked about much is tribes like the Cherokees were allowed to make local adjustments in the proclamation line, which means they can willingly give up some more land if it will keep the peace, and they do a lot in the 1760s. So I can never leave my people out of a discussion too long, the Scots-Irish. Thanks to Ancestry.com, I know now that part of my family story. 1760, 1761, 1762, 1763, 1764, 1765, 1766, 1767, 1768, 1769, 1770, 1771, 1782, 1793, 1794, 1795, 1796, 1797, 1798, 1799, 1700, 1701, 1702, 1703, 1704, 1705, 1706, 1707, 1708, 1709, 1710, 1711, 1712, 1713, 1714, 1715, 1716, 1717, 1718, 1719, 1720, 1721, 1722, 1723, 1724, 1725, 1726, 1727, 1728, 1729, 1730, 1731, 1732, 1733, 1734, 1735, 1736, 1737, 1738, 1739, 1740, 1741, 1742, 1743, 1744, 1745, 1746, 1747, 1748, 1749, 1750, 1751, 1752, 1753, 1754, 1755, 1756, 1757, 1758, 1759, 1760, 1761, 1762, 1763, 1764, 1765, 1766, 1767, 1768, 1769, 1770 Not a drop of Indian blood, by the way, which both sides of my families told me we had in great quantity. Cherokee on the father's side, Creek on the mother's side, not a drop. Brits, Scots-Irish, Welsh, basically everybody that drives a truck now in Britain, that would be my people. But they arrive in the backcountry, coming in later in areas than other settlers along the coast. And actually, the Scots-Irish came in with the Germans when both groups came into the southern backcountry. Sometimes these new arrivals, right, they can't get land on the east coast, so the only thing left to them is land near the mountains. Sometimes they trespassed innocently on Indian land, not knowing they were on Indian land. And what I've discovered is there were hucksters in place who sold them fraudulent land deeds. So even when they tried to do the right thing and use their last money they brought from home to buy land, the huckster selling the land didn't have the legal authority. It was not their land to sell. But you know, there's always people taking advantage of immigrants, right? You're right off the boat, somebody was there to sell you something, magic beans or something. Well, sometimes they bought fraudulent land deeds, and then sometimes they just settled willfully. And this shows them kind of the line they took down the Great Wagon Road and where they go in the backcountry. Early in 1771, a group of Cherokee leaders adjusted the boundary line because they felt sorry for settlers living on their land. And according to the Cherokees, it was the women and children settlers they felt sorry for. And so they would agree to give up more land. They would willingly adjust the proclamation line. And leaders like Attakulla always signed off on this. This is pure appeasement. This is giving up land to keep the peace because they don't want to repeat the disasters of 1760 and 61. Well, in 1772, another community, this time on the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers, they wanted a boundary adjustment again. New settlers, newly arrived. And so we're talking about people in this part of East Tennessee. Cherokee leaders agreed to lease the Watauga lands to white settlers. So the people on those lands already are on leased land. The lease is going to end. But these Watauga settlers want the government to formalize and make it a permanent land transfer. And on top of this, you get Colonel Richard Henderson, a land speculator who had organized a company that was going to initiate the sale, the transfer. And basically all he's asking for is most of the modern state of Kentucky. That's the transfer that he has in mind. So he brought some pretty heavy firepower to the Cherokee leaders. He brought them Daniel Boone. And there is a connection between Boone and the Cherokees. A Cherokee man killed his son Israel. And so the Cherokees know Boone. Henderson brought in 6 wagon loads of merchandise worth $50,000. And he also brought a generous supply of rum to lubricate the discussion for the transfer. And so again, the major chiefs come forward, including Attakulla, being asked to sign off on the permanent transfer of this land. Notice in a bargain like this, most of the Cherokee chiefs did not speak English. All of them, except Attakulla, thought this was an extension of the lease. Attakulla knows it is a permanent sale. So, meet his son, dragging canoe, Shiungu Shini. He is the firstborn to Attakulla, who was Wolf Clan, and his wife, Naomi Ali. So which clan would Dragon Canoe be?
Paint Clan.
Very good. You know your matrilineal clans. So he was born sometime in the 1740s. He had several siblings, a large group of brothers and sisters that included people that his father adopted. Well, he considered David Cameron his adopted brother. His father, Attakulla, adopted Cameron. That would have been into the Wolf Clan, though. So the elder generation spoke about this land transfer, and then, by the way, if you've ever wondered where Dragon Canoe got his name, he was a little boy, too small to go on a war expedition. he snuck along, hid along the way, and he surprised his father and older brothers, or uncles. And the father said, well, you can go with us if you are strong enough to lift your canoe over your head and portage it to the river. And he couldn't lift it and carry it, he could only drag it, hence a lifetime name, Shiungun Shini, as he is dragging the canoe. Dragon Canoe gave a very powerful speech at that meeting, which turned out to be the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. He told both his father's generation of leaders and the British and Henderson that whole Indian nations had melted away like snowballs in the sun before the white man's advance. They leave scarcely a name of our people except those wrongly reported by their destroyers. The tribes had always assumed that white settlers would stop at the mountains. Now it was clear they would not. And he used the Watauga land and the land cession they were there to talk about as a proof. Ironically, he said that the whites would never stop moving the Cherokees if they agreed to this. Boy, was he right. He actually said one day we'll be on the edge of some distant ocean if we keep agreeing to stuff like this. So, the talks lasted 4 days, and Attakulikula and the chiefs signed off on this. Dragon Canoe warned Henderson, Colonel Henderson, that he would find the land a dark and bloody ground, Kentucky. And the traditional chiefs signed, and Dragon Canoe left the meeting, never negotiated with white settlers again. So this creates a generational split between a new generation of leaders like Dragon Canoe and literally his father's generation. What Dragon Canoe will do, and in the interest of time, I'm going to shorthand this because I know we have a meeting in just a minute. Dragon Canoe is going to bring like-minded Cherokees behind them. They will make Lookout Mountain their base of operations. They will build towns all up and down the Tennessee River. Come on, don't let me down there. They will build towns up and down the Tennessee River. They will become known as the Chickamauga Cherokees. They are breaking away from traditional government. And if you notice the date of this, 1774, this is right on the edge of the American Revolution. What Dragon Canoe and his followers will do, and you see some of their towns here, including Graysville, Georgia, Soddy Daisy, Falling Water, and never to be left out, Ooltewah. They are going to, with the help of the British government, they are going to attack the Patriots during the war. They're going to use the American Revolution as the perfect moment to strike for a Cherokee revolution of their own. They are going to harass all backcountry settlements and try to drive all settlers, illegal or not, out of Cherokee country. And so to my way of thinking, they become a patriot movement within the Cherokees, and they will fight on for the next 15 years. So let me talk about, in conclusion, the damage of this. As I said, the British government tried to support this revolution as much as they could. They funded Dragon Canoe, they supplied them food, supplies, weapons. The British Indian Superintendency tried to send a letter to the illegal Watauga settlers. And the letter, the original letter, said, you need to vacate these are Cherokee lands, and if you do this, we will give you equivalent land in West Florida. So all it was an offer of land for land. A Watauga settler named Jesse Benton decided to forge this letter and create a brand new one. And in his version of the letter, it still started with warning the Watauga settlers they needed to get off their land. This is Johnson City, Tennessee, for just a modern reference. The new forged letter said, you need to get off these lands, and the British Army is going to bring a combined Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw army up into the backcountry and make devastating war on the Patriots. Well, it's interesting, the Watauga settlers took this forgery and sent it to the Continental Congress. It was published in the Virginia Gazette, something that all the founding fathers and the Patriot leaders would have been reading. The forged letter made the press at the exact same time that Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, including that famous line, blaming George III with bringing on all the merciless Indian savages of our frontier. So this gave the Patriots their hatred of Southeastern Indians in general, and Cherokees in particular. For a long time, the Patriots had been fearing that the Brits would bring the Indians down from the backcountry and attack Patriots, while bringing up armies from the coast. They would catch them in the middle in an unstoppable vice and destroy the Patriots. This forged letter actually created that fear. And then when Dragging Canoe began to attack backcountry settlements, it sort of brought the fear to reality. The end of this, the Cherokees are going to be forced in the 1790s to sign surrender treaties. They will, and the government, U.S. government has a policy at the time, any surrender treaty will automatically require huge cessions of land. And so the Dragging Canoe Rebellion, started by the son of a very famous peace chief, is going to be what propels them into this journey where they come out at the end not only giving up land, but giving up their sovereignty to become, as I had to tell the book editor what civilized means. Civilized means being brought into the American Civilization Program, where the government, the U.S. Senate, made decisions for them. No longer sovereign, but a subject people. But I will end the way the Cherokees always like things to end, and that is with the statement, "We are still here." After everything we've been through, we are still here. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And it's always dangerous to let a historian fire up and talk about something that may not shut us up. But if anybody has a question, I'd love to try to answer, or we will.
Where is Carter's Valley?
Let's see if I can show you on maps. Sometimes maps. Right there.
What would that mean to modern time?
I would say northern Tennessee, right on the Kentucky border. But I'm not a map expert.
We have one